The dense Canadian wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction, its towering pines swaying gently in the crisp morning breeze. Ranger John Harris adjusted the straps of his pack as he began his daily patrol. For years, these woods had been his sanctuary, a place where he found solace in the rhythms of nature. The sun peeked through the trees, casting golden streaks across the forest floor. Birds chirped overhead, their melodies occasionally interrupted by the rustling of leaves as small creatures scurried through the underbrush. It was a peaceful morning, but John couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As he approached a clearing, a strange sound caught his attention. Faint and intermittent, it was a low, guttural moan that seemed to echo through the trees. He paused, tilting his head to locate the source. "What is that?" he muttered to himself, his senses on high alert. The sound came again, more distinct this time. It wasn't the cry of a bird or the rustle of a small animal, it was deeper, heavier, and tinged with pain. John followed the noise cautiously, his boots crunching softly against the forest floor. The sound grew louder as he neared a dense thicket of bushes. Carefully pushing the branches aside, he froze at the sight before him. In the shadows of the thicket lay a massive bear, its fur matted with dirt and blood. The animal was trapped, its paw caught in a steel snare that dug cruelly into its flesh. A length of wire looped around its neck, restricting its movements, while its back leg was tangled in another crude trap. John's breath caught in his throat. The bear's chest rose and fell in labored breaths, its amber eyes flickering with both pain and exhaustion. It tried to move as John stepped closer, letting out a deep, guttural growl. "Easy there, big guy," John said softly, holding his hands out in a calming gesture. He quickly assessed the situation. The traps were vicious, likely the work of poachers who had no regard for the laws protecting wildlife in the area. Anger flared in his chest, but he pushed it aside. The bear didn't have time for his emotions, it needed help, and fast. John crouched a safe distance away, speaking in a low, steady tone. "I'm here to help you. I know you don't understand, but I promise, I'm not going to hurt you." The bear's growl softened into a low rumble, its eyes locked on John's every movement. Reaching into his pack, John pulled out a tranquilizer dart and a small rifle. It was risky, if the bear panicked, it could lunge and put both their lives in danger. But there was no other way to free it without further injuring the animal or himself. Taking a deep breath, John aimed carefully and fired. The dart hit its mark, embedding itself in the bear's muscular shoulder. The animal flinched but didn't react violently, its strength too depleted to resist. Within minutes, the tranquilizer took effect, and the bear's body slumped into a heavy sleep. John wasted no time. He approached cautiously, his hands steady as he examined the traps. The snare around the bear's neck had cut deep into its skin, leaving raw, bloody marks. Using wire cutters, he carefully snipped through the metal, his heart pounding with each snap. Next, he moved to the bear's paw, where the steel trap had clamped down mercilessly. The mechanism was old and rusted, but John managed to pry it open with a crowbar, freeing the animal's mangled foot. Finally, he untangled the wire from the bear's hind leg, his muscles straining as he worked quickly. By the time he finished, sweat dripped from his brow, and his hands trembled from the effort. The bear lay motionless, its breathing slow and even. John stepped back, his chest heaving. "You're free now," he said quietly, though the bear couldn't hear him. As the tranquilizer began to wear off, the bear stirred slightly, its massive frame shifting on the forest floor. John knew he couldn't leave it here, not in its weakened state, with injuries that could easily become infected. Reaching into his pack, he pulled out his satellite phone and dialed the nearest wildlife clinic. "This is Ranger Harris. I've got an emergency, a bear caught in multiple traps. It's injured, but stable. I'm going to need transport to the clinic ASAP." The voice on the other end responded quickly. "We'll send a team your way. Hang tight." John ended the call and crouched next to the bear, his gaze softening. For a moment, he felt a strange sense of connection to the creature. Despite its size and power, it was vulnerable, another victim of human cruelty. "We'll get you through this," John murmured. "I promise." The forest around John seemed quieter now, as if the trees and wildlife were holding their breath in anticipation. With the bear still sedated, he waited for the wildlife rescue team to arrive. Kneeling by its side, he couldn't help but marvel at the creature's sheer size. Even in its weakened state, the bear's muscular frame radiated power. John glanced at the mangled paw where the steel trap had bitten deep into its flesh. The wounds were severe, but the bear's breathing had stabilized. He took a water bottle from his pack and gently poured a small stream over the raw areas to clean away some of the dirt and dried blood. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" he murmured, though he knew the bear couldn't hear him. "But you're still hanging on. That's something." The distant rumble of an engine broke the silence, and John looked up to see the wildlife rescue truck navigating the narrow forest trail. Relief swept over him as the vehicle came to a stop, and two members of the rescue team stepped out, their movements efficient and purposeful. "Ranger Harris," one of them called. "That's me," John replied, standing and waving them over. The team, a man named Eric and a woman named Carla, approached with a stretcher and a first aid kit. Their eyes widened slightly at the sight of the bear, but they quickly focused on the task at hand. "This one's in bad shape," Carla said, kneeling beside the animal to examine its injuries. "You did a good job stabilizing it, though. We'll need to move fast," Eric added, setting up the stretcher. "It's lucky you found it when you did." With careful coordination, the three of them worked to lift the bear onto the stretcher. Even sedated, its sheer weight made the task challenging, but they managed to secure it safely. As they loaded the bear into the truck, John felt a pang of unease. "Will it make it?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. Carla hesitated before responding. "It's hard to say. The wounds are deep, and there's a lot of damage to the paw. But we'll do everything we can." John nodded, his jaw tightening. He climbed into the truck's passenger seat, determined to see the bear through to the clinic. The drive to the wildlife clinic was tense. The truck bounced over uneven terrain, and the bear shifted slightly with each jolt. Carla monitored its vitals, while Eric focused on navigating the rough trail. John stared out the window, his thoughts swirling. He'd encountered injured animals before, but something about this bear felt different. Maybe it was the look in its eyes, more resigned than feral, or the sheer cruelty of the traps that had ensnared it. "This wasn't an accident," he said suddenly, breaking the silence. Carla glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "The traps," John explained, his tone grim. "They weren't just randomly placed. Someone knew what they were doing. This bear wasn't supposed to get out alive." Eric frowned. "You think it was poachers?" John nodded. "No doubt about it. This area's been a hotspot for illegal activity lately. I've seen their handiwork before, but this is worse." They reached the clinic just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The staff was ready and waiting, rushing out with a gurney to transfer the bear inside. John stayed close as they wheeled it into the examination room. Bright lights illuminated the space, and the hum of medical equipment filled the air. A veterinarian named Dr. Lee took charge, her calm demeanor putting John at ease. "We'll clean the wounds, administer antibiotics, and see if we can save the paw," Dr. Lee explained. "The next 24 hours will be critical." John watched as the team got to work, their movements swift and precise. They cleaned the bear's injuries, applied dressings, and inserted N4 to deliver fluids. It was a delicate operation, but the team's expertise was evident in every step. As the hours passed, John remained by the observation window, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Carla brought him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a grateful nod. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "We'll take it from here." "I know," John replied, his gaze fixed on the bear. But I can't just walk away. Not yet. Carla smiled faintly. You've got a good heart, Ranger. Not everyone would do what you did today. John shrugged. It wasn't a choice. It was the right thing to do. Late into the night, Dr. Lee emerged from the examination room, looking tired but satisfied. The surgery went well, she announced. The paw was worse than we thought, but we managed to save it. It'll take time to heal, but the bear has a strong chance. Relief washed over John like a wave. Thank you, he said, his voice filled with sincerity. Dr. Lee nodded. Thank yourself too. If you hadn't acted so quickly, we wouldn't be having this conversation. As the clinic quieted down, John finally allowed himself to rest. Sitting in a chair near the bear's enclosure, he watched as it began to stir, its massive body shifting slightly under the blankets. For the first time in hours, John smiled. The bear was safe, and for now, that was enough. The morning sun cast long rays through the clinic windows as John stepped back into the observation room. The bear, nicknamed Kodiak by the staff, was awake but groggy. It lay curled on its side, its injured paw wrapped tightly in clean bandages. For the first time since its rescue, John saw something other than pain in its eyes. There was a quiet resilience, a flicker of life that hadn't been there before. How's he doing? John asked as Dr. Lee entered the room. He's a fighter, she replied with a tired smile. His vitals are improving, and the antibiotics are working. If we can keep infection at bay, he has a real shot at recovery. John exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. That's good to hear. Dr. Lee hesitated. But there's something else you should know. She gestured for John to follow her into the clinic's small office. On the desk, Dr. Lee laid out the remnants of the traps John had removed from Kodiak. The steel snare, the rusted wire, and the vicious clamp were all crude but effective tools of cruelty. These traps weren't set by amateurs, she explained. Look at the markings here. She pointed to a faint emblem etched into the metal. This is a signature. It's common for poachers to mark their traps so they can claim their kills later. John frowned, his jaw tightening. Have you seen this mark before? Dr. Lee nodded grimly. A few times, always on traps found in this region. Whoever's behind this has been operating here for years, but they're careful, no one's been able to catch them. John's fists clenched at his sides. He had suspected poachers were responsible, but seeing the evidence laid out before him ignited a fire in his chest. They've gone too far, he said, his voice low and steady. It's time to stop them. Over the next few days, John worked tirelessly to set a plan in motion. He contacted local wildlife enforcement, sharing the evidence from the clinic and his suspicions about the poachers' activities. Together, they devised a strategy to catch the perpetrators in the act. We'll need eyes in the forest, John said during a meeting with the enforcement team. Hidden cameras, motion sensors, anything that can track movement near potential trapping sites. Agreed, one of the officers replied. But we'll need someone who knows the terrain to set it up. John nodded. Leave that part to me. Equipped with cameras and tracking devices, John returned to the forest. He chose locations carefully, focusing on areas where signs of illegal activity had been reported. It was grueling work, requiring hours of hiking and meticulous attention to detail. As he set up the last camera, he paused to look around. The forest was silent, save for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was hard to imagine that something so serene could hide such cruelty. Not for long, he muttered under his breath. Back at the clinic, Kodiak continued to recover. The staff marveled at the bear's resilience, noting how quickly he adapted to his new routine. Though still wary of humans, Kodiak showed no signs of aggression, even when the staff approached to change his bandages or administer medication. John visited whenever he could, bringing fresh berries and fish as small offerings. He would sit quietly near Kodiak's enclosure, watching as the bear ate or rested. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a bond forged in the chaos of their first encounter. "You're getting stronger every day," John said during one visit, his voice soft. "Soon, you'll be ready to go back where you belong." One evening, as John reviewed footage from the cameras he had placed in the forest, his heart skipped a beat. On the screen, a shadowy figure moved through the trees, carrying what appeared to be a bundle of traps. The timestamp indicated the footage was less than 24 hours old. "This is it," John said, picking up his phone to call the enforcement team. Within hours, a plan was in place. The team would stake out the area captured in the footage, waiting for the poacher to return. John insisted on being part of the operation, his determination unshaken. The stakeout was tense, the hours stretching long as the team waited in silence. John's pulse quickened every time a branch snapped or an animal rustled in the underbrush. Finally, as dawn began to break, the poacher emerged. He moved confidently, unaware of the hidden cameras or the team lying in wait. John signaled to the others, his hand steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Now," he whispered. The team moved swiftly, surrounding the poacher before he had a chance to react. Startled, the man dropped his bundle of traps, his eyes darting around in panic. "You're done," John said firmly, stepping forward. The poacher tried to argue, but the evidence was overwhelming. Between the marked traps, the footage, and years of accumulated reports, there was no escape. The enforcement officers cuffed him and led him away, their expressions a mix of relief and satisfaction. As the team packed up their equipment, John allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had been served, but he knew the work was far from over. Back at the clinic, Kodiak's progress was the final piece of good news. Dr. Lee confirmed that the bear was ready for release, his wounds healed and his strength restored. "It's time," she said. John nodded, feeling both pride and a twinge of sadness. "Let's make it happen." The morning of Kodiak's release was serene, the air crisp and alive with the subtle hum of the wilderness. John arrived at the wildlife clinic early, his mind racing with a mix of anticipation and unease. The sight of Kodiak, now standing tall in his enclosure, brought him a deep sense of relief. The bear's posture was steady, his wounds healing well under the team's diligent care. "He knows something's happening," Dr. Lee said as she approached John, a smile softening her features. John nodded, his eyes locked on the bear. "He's been through so much. It's amazing to see him like this." The preparation for the release was methodical, each step carefully planned. The team assembled a reinforced transport cage, large enough to accommodate Kodiak's massive frame while ensuring his safety during the journey. Luring him into the cage proved to be a delicate task. Eric, one of the assistants, placed a trail of fresh salmon and berries leading into the enclosure. Kodiak hesitated at first, sniffing the air cautiously before stepping forward. Each movement was deliberate, his instinct still sharp despite weeks of recovery. "Good boy," John murmured under his breath as Kodiak entered the cage. Once inside, the team swiftly secured the door, their relief palpable. The truck ride to the wilderness reserve was quieter than John had anticipated. Kodiak seemed calm, his massive form shifting occasionally as the vehicle navigated uneven terrain. John sat in the passenger seat, his thoughts a swirl of pride and concern. Eric, who was driving, glanced at him. "Think he'll remember all the survival skills he needs out there?" John nodded slowly. "He will. It's in his blood. But still, it's hard not to worry." The truck jolted slightly as they approached the reserve, the dense forest stretching endlessly before them. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the ground. It was a place of untouched beauty, the kind of sanctuary Kodiak deserved. Dana, the wildlife specialist, was waiting for them at the release site. She had chosen the location carefully, a secluded area near a riverbank with abundant food sources and plenty of cover. "This is perfect for him," Dana said as she led the group to the designated spot. "We've monitored the area extensively. He'll have everything he needs to thrive here." The team worked together to position the transport cage in the clearing. John stood by, his heart pounding as they prepared to open the door. "Ready?" Dana asked, her hand hovering over the latch. John took a deep breath. "Ready." The door creaked open, and for a moment, nothing happened. Kodiak remained inside, his massive form crouched low as he surveyed the unfamiliar surroundings. The team watched in silence, their anticipation almost tangible. Slowly, Kodiak stepped out, his paws sinking into the soft earth. He sniffed the air, his ears twitching as he absorbed the sounds of the forest. Each step was cautious, deliberate, as if testing the world he was re-entering. John's throat tightened as he watched. "Go on," he whispered. "This is your home now." As if understanding the words, Kodiak's movements became more confident. He trotted forward, his hulking frame disappearing into the trees. The forest seemed to embrace him, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filling the space he left behind. The team stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the moment settling over them. Dana finally broke the stillness, her voice tinged with awe. "He's going to be okay," she said. John nodded, though his eyes remained on the spot where Kodiak had vanished. "Yeah," he said quietly. "He will be." The drive back to the clinic was bittersweet. The empty cage in the truck's bed served as a reminder of Kodiak's absence, but it also symbolized a victory. The bear was free, and John couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment despite the ache of letting go. "You okay?" Eric asked, breaking the silence. "Yeah," John replied. "It's just, you spend so much time fighting to save something, and then you have to let it go. It's not easy." Eric nodded thoughtfully. "But that's the point, isn't it? To give them the life they're supposed to have." John smiled faintly. "Yeah. That's the point." Back at the clinic, the staff busied themselves cleaning Kodiak's now empty enclosure. The space felt strangely quiet without him, a stark contrast to the energy he had brought during his recovery. Dr. Lee joined John by the observation window, where they had spent countless hours monitoring Kodiak. "It feels different, doesn't it?" she said. "It does," John admitted. "But it's a good kind of different." Dr. Lee smiled. "You should be proud of what you did. Kodiak wouldn't be out there without you." John shrugged, his expression reflective. "It wasn't just me. It was all of us. And honestly, I think Kodiak did most of the work. He fought to survive." In the weeks that followed, the team tracked Kodiak's progress through a GPS collar attached before his release. The data showed him exploring the reserve, moving between the riverbank and nearby meadows. He was thriving, adapting quickly to his new environment. "He's even found a few other bears in the area," Dana reported during a follow-up call. "It looks like he's staking out his territory." Hearing this filled John with pride. Kodiak's journey from a trapped and wounded animal to a strong, independent bear felt like a testament to the resilience of life itself. Inspired by Kodiak's story, John launched a local campaign to raise awareness about the dangers of illegal trapping. He organized community events, shared Kodiak's story with schools, and partnered with conservation groups to advocate for stricter enforcement of wildlife protection laws. The response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life joined the effort, inspired by the tale of the bear who had overcome incredible odds. One evening, as John reviewed the latest footage from the reserve's motion-activated cameras, a familiar figure appeared on the screen. It was Kodiak, standing at the edge of the riverbank. The bear looked strong and confident, his coat glistening in the sunlight. John leaned back in his chair, a sense of peace washing over him. Kodiak was where he belonged, living the life he was meant to live. "Good job, big guy," John said quietly, as if the bear could hear him. The chill of dawn wrapped the forest in a quiet stillness as John prepared for another patrol. Months had passed since Kodiak's release, and while his days were filled with the usual duties of a ranger, John couldn't shake the bear's story from his mind. He often found himself replaying the moment Kodiak disappeared into the wilderness, a symbol of resilience and survival. Today, however, felt different. The air carried an inexplicable energy, as if the forest itself was on the cusp of revealing a secret. John's patrol led him along a familiar trail near the riverbank, where Kodiak's GPS signal had last been tracked. The wildlife reserve had become a sanctuary not just for Kodiak but for countless other creatures, each thriving in the untouched expanse. As he rounded a bend, John paused. A rustling sound came from the thicket ahead, followed by the unmistakable snap of twigs. His hand instinctively moved to the tranquilizer gun at his hip, though he didn't feel threatened. From the shadows emerged a massive figure. It was Kodiak. John froze, his breath catching in his throat. The bear stood at the edge of the clearing, his amber eyes locked onto John's. Kodiak looked stronger than ever, his coat thick and glossy, his posture commanding. For a moment, neither moved, the space between them charged with unspoken understanding. "You remember me, don't you?" John murmured, his voice barely audible. Kodiak tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching. Then, to John's astonishment, the bear took a single step forward. John remained still, his heart pounding as Kodiak approached. The bear stopped a few feet away, his massive frame towering over the ranger. For a moment, it seemed as though Kodiak was studying him, his gaze steady and deliberate. Then, in a gesture that John would never forget, Kodiak lowered his head briefly, almost like a bow, before turning and lumbering back into the forest. John stood rooted to the spot, his mind racing. He had spent years in the wild, witnessing countless interactions with animals, but this moment was unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were meant for Kodiak or the forest itself. The encounter reignited John's passion for conservation work. Inspired by Kodiak's progress and the connection they shared, he intensified his efforts to protect the reserve. He organized patrols with local volunteers, educated communities about the dangers of poaching, and worked closely with policymakers to enforce stricter wildlife protection laws. Kodiak's story became a rallying cry, spreading far beyond the boundaries of the reserve. Media outlets picked up on the tale, drawing attention to the broader issues of illegal trapping and habitat destruction. One of the most significant milestones came when a group of local students visited the reserve as part of a wildlife education program John had helped organize. He shared Kodiak's journey with them, emphasizing the importance of empathy in action. "This forest belongs to all of us," John said, his voice steady but impassioned. "Every creature here has a role to play, and it's our responsibility to protect them." Kodiak's story isn't just about a bear, it's about what we can achieve when we choose compassion over indifference. The students listened intently, their eyes wide with curiosity and wonder. As the months turned into years, Kodiak sightings became rarer, though the bear's presence was still felt throughout the reserve. Motion-activated cameras occasionally captured his image, a reminder of his enduring strength and survival. For John, those glimpses were enough. He didn't need to see Kodiak every day to know the bear was thriving. The connection they shared had left a lasting imprint, shaping John's work and his understanding of the natural world. One evening, as John sat on his cabin porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, he heard a familiar rustle in the woods. His pulse quickened, and he leaned forward, straining to see through the gathering darkness. A shadow moved between the trees, large and deliberate. It paused for a moment, and though the light was fading, John could make out the unmistakable silhouette of Kodiak. The bear stood still, his amber eyes glowing faintly in the twilight. For a fleeting moment, their gazes met once more. Then, without a sound, Kodiak turned and vanished into the forest. John sat back, a slow smile spreading across his face. The encounter felt like a full-circle moment, a quiet affirmation of everything they had been through. Kodiak was no longer the injured, frightened creature John had pulled from the traps. He was a survivor, a testament to the resilience of the wild and the power of compassion. And as the forest settled into its nightly rhythm, John knew one thing for certain: their paths had crossed for a reason, and the legacy of that connection would live on. The forest was quiet as John stood at the edge of the reserve, his gaze sweeping over the expanse of trees and meadows that had become as familiar to him as the back of his hand. It had been 2 years since Kodiak's release, and the bear's story continued to echo through the community and beyond. John's work as a ranger had taken on new meaning since that fateful day. He had always cared deeply about the wilderness, but Kodiak's journey had opened his eyes to the profound connections that could form between humans and the natural world. The reserve itself had changed in small but meaningful ways. With new protections in place and a heightened awareness of the dangers of poaching, the wildlife population was thriving. Local schools regularly brought students to the reserve, where John and his team led educational programs about conservation and coexistence. During one such program, a young girl raised her hand, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Is Kodiak still out there?" she asked. John smiled, his expression warm. "He is. We don't see him often, but we know he's doing well. The cameras have shown him exploring, hunting, and even meeting other bears. He's made a home for himself here." The girl beamed, her excitement contagious. "He's like a superhero." John chuckled. "In a way, he is. But remember, he's not the only one who deserves our care. Every animal here has its own story, and it's up to us to make sure they have the chance to live it." As the students left, their chatter filling the air, John felt a sense of pride. Kodiak's story had become more than just a tale of survival, it was a symbol of hope and action. One evening, John received an unexpected call from Dana, the wildlife specialist who had helped release Kodiak. Her voice was filled with excitement. "You're not going to believe this," she said. "We've spotted Kodiak again, and he's not alone." John's heart leapt. "What do you mean?" "He's with a cub," Dana replied. "We're pretty sure it's his." The news filled John with a joy he hadn't felt in years. Kodiak, the bear who had once been on the brink of death, had not only survived but had started a family. It was the ultimate testament to the strength of nature and the impact of compassion. A week later, John made his way to the reserve, hoping for a glimpse of Kodiak and the cub. As he walked through the familiar trails, he found himself reflecting on how far they had both come. When he reached the riverbank, he stopped in his tracks. There, in the fading light, stood Kodiak. By his side was a small cub, its fur a slightly lighter shade than its father's. The two bears moved gracefully along the water's edge, their bond evident in every step. John didn't move, afraid to disrupt the moment. Instead, he watched as Kodiak glanced in his direction, their eyes meeting for what felt like the 100th time yet still carried the weight of something extraordinary. Kodiak held his gaze for a moment longer before turning and leading the cub into the forest. As the sun dipped below the horizon, John felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Kodiak's legacy was more than just survival, it was renewal, growth, and the promise of a future where nature and humanity could coexist. For John, the encounter was a quiet reminder of why he had chosen this path. The work was never easy, but it was always worth it.